Jeanette Beaver was born in October of 1919, along with her twin sister Grace. Grace died of diphtheria at a young age, making Jeanette's parents all the more protective of their surviving daughter. Jeanette moved around a lot as a child because of her father's career with the Army. When he retired from the military, the family set up a permanent home outside of Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Jeanette was very independent and adventurous. She loved the outdoors and excelled at both artistic and athletic endeavors. By 1961, Jeanette was Jeanette Sullivan. She had a brief marriage during World War II and then married her first husband's good friend, Dennis Sullivan, in 1945. However, shortly after the birth of their second child, she had divorced Dennis after enduring years of abuse. In 1961, she was a single mother supporting her two daughters, 15-year-old Dennise and 4-year-old Jean, on her own in Connecticut. The family did not have a lot of money, but Jeanette was very resourceful. She was a skilled seamstress, a talent which provided her with an income and her girls with most of their clothes. In the summer of 1961, Jeanette took Dennise with her on a road trip out west. Jean was left behind in Connecticut with her grandparents because she had a tendency to get carsick. Dennise had been very excited when the trip was first being discussed, and was told she could come along if she finished the school year with good grades, which she successfully did. Along with Jeanette and Dennise on this trip was a man named Charles Boothroyd. Charles was a widower who had faced many tragedies in his life, even before he lost his wife, Dorothy, in 1959. Dorothy and Charles were the parents of 5 children. In 1934, Dorothy had given birth to a set of twins, the couple's 3rd and 4th sons. The 2 boys, August and Axel, were both born with serious medical problems. August died just 2 days after his birth, and Axel only lived for a week. The couple's 5th child and only daughter, Lillian, was born 2 years later. Their oldest son, Charles, had served in the Navy in post-World War II Europe. Their second-born son, Albert, tried to follow in his older brother's footsteps, but was rejected from the Navy because of his terrible eyesight. He then tried to join the Army instead. Despite finding that he had 2400 eyesight and was colorblind, the Army accepted him. Within a year of his enlistment, the Korean War began, and Albert was sent to Korea. He was one of 2,000 American soldiers captured by North Korean and Chinese forces on November 30th, 1950. Albert was declared missing in action, and propaganda reports coming out of China would later list him as a prisoner of war. The Boothroyd family spent years waiting for news of Albert, while hearing reports of the terrible conditions in North Korean POW camps. In August of 1953, the Army notified them that Albert was dead. They would not learn the details of his death until February of 1954. Captain William Shadish was the camp physician at Hofong Camp, where he had been a POW along with Albert Boothroyd. He reported that he had witnessed Albert die of starvation, exposure, and dysentery on January 31st, 1951. Albert's remains were never recovered. Albert's death was devastating to his family, and most likely contributed to his mother's declining health throughout the rest of the 1950s. Dorothy died in 1959, 3 days shy of her 50th birthday. Out of her 5 children, only her son Charlie and her daughter Lillian were alive to mourn her. Despite the fact that Charles Boothroyd was more than 10 years older than Jeanette Sullivan, they had begun seeing each other after meeting at church. Charles soon became a positive figure in Jeanette's daughters' lives, and his family accepted the romance despite the age gap because they felt that he deserved something that made him happy. Charles would later tell Jeanette's daughter Jean that he and her mother had planned to get married once they arrived out west at the end of their road trip. They never got the chance to, though, because that trip was tragically cut short. Jeanette, Dennise, and Charles left Connecticut in a Volkswagen Beetle on June 30th, 1961. They made stops in Iowa, Nebraska, and Colorado as they made their way across the country. On July 4th, the trio was in Dead Horse Point State Park in Moab, Utah, where they were able to enjoy the sunset. While they were there, they met a man who was friendly towards them and told them facts about local history. After 2 hours, the man left. When Jeanette, Dennise, and Charles were later driving away from the park, they saw the man again, now on the side of the road with the hood of his car up. They pulled over to see if they could help him. Charles got out of the car and walked up to the man, who said he thought he was having generator trouble. Charles went back to his car to get a flashlight, and when he returned, the man pulled a rifle out of his car and pointed it at Charles. When Charles asked him if this was a robbery, the man replied that he guessed it was and asked for their money. Jeanette Sullivan was furious that the man who they had been so friendly with and they had stopped to help had pulled a gun. She got out of the car as Charles was about to hand over the wallet, which contained all of the money they had left for the remainder of the trip, approximately $250. She took the wallet, threw a few bills at the man, and began walking back to the car. The man screamed at her to stop, to which she coldly replied, "You've got your money now. What else do you want?" The man then shot Jeanette in the back of the head. He then turned the rifle on Charles and shot him in the face, just below his right eye. Charles fell to the ground and instinctively used his arms to cover his head. The man shot him a second time, at very close range, in almost the exact same spot. The man dragged Jeanette's body to the side of the road and began walking back to Charles. If he had tried to move him, he most likely would have realized that Charles was miraculously still alive and shot him again. Luckily, he was distracted by the Volkswagen as it began to move. Dennise had jumped from the back of the car into the driver's seat. She was only 15, but Charles had given her some instruction on how cars worked, and he had left the motor running, so Dennise did her best to use the car to escape. Charles regained consciousness just in time to see the man get back in his car and drive after the Volkswagen. He tried to stand, but his injuries were too severe, and he fell back to the ground. Just a few minutes later, an oil rig foreman named Leonard Brown was driving down the road when another car raced past him, traveling in the opposite direction. A few hundred yards down the road, he passed a Volkswagen on the side of the road, but assumed that the other car he had just seen would have stopped to help if someone needed assistance. Then, less than a mile after that, he discovered Charles Boothroyd in the road, covered in blood. Leonard luckily had a radio telephone in his car for work, and he was able to radio his company's office to ask them to call for help. Leonard then got Jeanette, who was alive but unconscious, and Charles into his car, in hopes of getting them medical help more quickly. On the way, he flagged down a police car on its way to the scene, and the officer gave him an escort as he drove more than 80 miles per hour to the Dr. I.W. Allen Hospital in Moab. Despite his speed, Jeanette was pronounced dead at the hospital. Charles survived despite his extensive injuries. Dennise was nowhere to be found. Charles was able to tell police what had happened leading up to Dennise's disappearance. He also gave them a description of the man and said that his name sounded like Oregon. Charles was also able to give them a partial plate number for his vehicle, which helped identify which county the car was registered in. The description of the man and the car were quickly spread amongst members of law enforcement, and roadblocks were soon in place in hopes of finding Jeanette's killer and hopefully rescuing Dennise. It appeared she had not made it very far trying to drive the Volkswagen before her mother's killer forced it off the road. Police presumed that he had forced Dennise into his car, potentially into the trunk. Despite a massive manhunt, aerial searches performed by both the Utah Highway Patrol and local volunteer private pilots, and bulletins being sent out to all law enforcement agencies within 500 miles of the crime scene, the killer, the car, and Dennise Sullivan were not seen for days. By noon on July 5th, both Charles and Jeanette's families had been notified about what had happened. Charles's son Charlie contacted Jeanette's parents and assured them he would do everything he could to help find Dennise. He and his uncle, Charles's brother Ernest, drove the more than 2,300 miles from Connecticut to Utah, barely stopping on the long journey, unsure if Charles would still be alive when they got to him. Miraculously, he was, and he would survive his serious injuries. The first break in the case came in the form of a phone call that had been made 3 days before the crime. The state employment office contacted the sheriff's office about the call, which it had received on July 1st. It was from a woman asking if they had any record of her husband, who had traveled to Moab the previous week in hopes of finding work and had not contacted her since his departure. She had hoped he had been in contact with them, but he had not. The woman had provided her name, but the person who took the call had not written it down, so when they relayed this conversation to the sheriff's office, all they could remember was that the man's first name was Benny, and the surname sounded like Oregon. This immediately connected the call to the manhunt, as Charles Boothroyd had described his assailant's surname in the same way. However, it was recognized for different reasons by a sheriff's deputy who overheard this report being made. One of his best friends was named Abel Aragon, who sometimes went by Benny. The deputy did not believe that Aragon was the killer they were looking for. He was one of the best people he knew. However, this meant that he was always willing to help people. The deputy feared that his friend was missing because he had stopped to help someone, as Charles, Jeanette, and Dennise had done, and had been killed. His car, matching the description of the car law enforcement was searching for, could have been the result of the killer stealing it from him and using it during his next crime. This theory would be proved incorrect on July 7th. Around 10:30 that evening, 2 FBI agents sent from Salt Lake City to help with the investigation were on their way to follow up on a tip when they came across the car half the state was looking for, a 1955 Ford sedan with license plate number CJ6626. They pulled it over at an intersection in Crescent Junction. The driver stopped, but rolled up his window and locked his door. After a brief exchange with one of the agents, in which the agent asked the driver if he were Abel Aragon, and the driver questioned if the agent was really with the FBI, the driver reached for something to his right. The agent could not stop him from picking up a .22 caliber pistol and shooting himself in the head. This all occurred near a gas station and the Crescent Junction town store. One FBI agent called out to 2 young men who were working at the time and had come out when they had seen the flashing red lights, telling them to call an ambulance. The other agent called in what had happened on the 2-way radio in their car. The owner of the store, who had been deputized by the sheriff, ran out with a tire iron to break open the passenger's side window of the Ford. He had to reach past the unconscious body of the driver to grab the keys in the ignition. He tossed the keys to one of the FBI agents, who used them to open the trunk of the car as quickly as he could, hoping to find Dennise Sullivan confined there, but alive. There was nothing in the trunk, except for Winchester ammunition boxes, storing mining and camping gear. There was no sign of Dennise. The agents tried to revive the driver so that they could ask him about Dennise, but with no luck. He was taken to the hospital, but declared dead shortly after midnight, never regaining consciousness. The man was Abel Aragon. 2 major mysteries remained. Where was Dennise Sullivan, and what had driven Aragon to become a criminal? Aragon was a married father of 5 who lived in Price, Utah, where he was respected by his neighbors. He was very conscientious, and all of his children were very well behaved. He had no criminal history, and, according to both his co-workers and the United States Navy, was a hero. Aragon had started working in Utah's coal mines as a teenager. In 1942, at the age of 16, he wanted to join the Marines to serve his country during World War II. He was too young to enlist, so he lied about his date of birth. He was actually born on July 6, 1926, but he listed his birthday as July 29, 1924, on his enlistment paperwork, so that he appeared old enough to serve, and was accepted. Aragon received the Navy Cross for his heroic behavior in Guam on July 22, 1944. He repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire over several hours during a mission, completing it despite being injured and losing 6 of the 8 other men who had been fighting with him. He was briefly hospitalized before returning to combat and went on to fight in the Battle of Iwo Jima. After the war ended, Aragon went back to the coal mines. He was working on July 19, 1957, when an accident took the lives of 3 miners. A 4th miner, Mike Milovich, was rescued by a group of miners. One of the rescuers, Harold Wilstead, later died as a result of being exposed to leaking gases and was the only rescuer named in published reports about the incident. However, according to Mike Milovich, Abel Aragon had been one of the men who brought him to safety. Aragon committing robbery, murder, attempted murder, and kidnapping all at once, when he had no history of violence or criminal activity, was completely shocking to his family and friends. While his crimes were out of character for him, Aragon was under serious stresses at the time, and there were indications that he may have been experiencing mental health struggles leading up to July 4th, 1961. In the early 1960s, the coal industry in Utah was on the decline. Aragon was laid off briefly in 1960, but later brought back to work. When he was laid off again in early 1961, however, it appeared his coal mining career was really over. Aragon found some odd jobs and received some unemployment compensation from the state, but was not bringing home enough money to support his family. He began traveling to Moab in hopes of finding work in the uranium mines there. It was around this time that some people began questioning the state of Aragon's mental health. In June of 1961, he met a couple, Genevieve and Lauren Johnson, who owned a peach orchard next to their modest home in Moab. They allowed Aragon to camp out in the orchard while he was in the area looking for work. Genevieve would later say that he expressed frustration with the fact that he had made so many sacrifices to serve his country, but was now unable to find work to support his family. She believed that he had developed some kind of mental problems as the result of his military service. However, neither she nor her husband viewed him as dangerous. We will never know why July 4th, 1961, was the day Abel Aragon went from being an upstanding citizen to a violent criminal. While he had been unemployed and in financial trouble for months, several stressors were more immediate to the day of the attack on Jeanette, Charles, and Dennise. His 15th wedding anniversary had been on June 15th, and he was unable to afford to celebrate it. He believed he had finally secured a job in a uranium mine on July 1st, but the offer fell through. His birthday was coming up on July 6th, and he had to face turning 35 and being unable to provide for his family. Instead of celebrating the 4th of July with his family, he was 100 miles away in one of the most remote sections of Utah, desperately searching for work to support them. Furthermore, the patriotic holiday may have exacerbated the frustration he felt with the country for allowing a decorated veteran to be without a job. Pondering Aragon's seemingly abrupt decision to turn to crime when all of his legitimate efforts to make money failed is an interesting exercise, but his suicide left investigators with no means of determining his thought process. The more pressing issue they were left with in the wake of his death was, of course, what happened to Dennise Sullivan. Authorities treated Dennise's case as a kidnapping and operated under the assumption that she was alive and needed to be rescued. This was, of course, the correct view to take, because if Dennise were alive, she would be counting on their quick action in order to remain so. However, Charles Boothroyd, who had witnessed Abel Aragon's abrupt embrace of violence, was not as optimistic about the young woman's chances of survival. When asked about Dennise by a reporter, he said that she couldn't possibly be alive. As devastating as the idea of Dennise being dead was, so were many of the possible alternatives. Immediately after she went missing, investigators feared Dennise may be injured but not receiving medical care, psychologically tormented by the man who killed her mother, or abandoned alone in the desert without food or water. Later, when he believed any hope of Dennise being alive was truly gone, Charles would say that he hoped Dennise at least met her death quickly, and that she had not suffered. The search for Dennise involved multiple law enforcement agencies and dozens of volunteers. Pilots searched from the air, and members of the search team on boats dragged the nearby Colorado River. Despite their best efforts, they did not find Dennise or her body. A few potential clues were uncovered, but whether or not any of them provide information about Dennise's fate remains uncertain. On July 7th, a pair of women's sneakers was found neatly placed along the Colorado River. Because it appeared they had been placed there deliberately, police thought perhaps Aragon had put them there to show that he had placed Dennise's body in the river. Some reports state that these were, in fact, Dennise's shoes. However, this appears to not be the case. The shoes were taken to the hospital where Charles was being treated, and he could not identify them as belonging to Dennise. Later examination of the 8mm film Charles had shot throughout the trip confirmed that the shoes Dennise had been wearing were red, not black, like the shoes found by the river. Witnesses would later report that they had seen Aragon in the area of Polar Mesa in the 2 days after the murders. A search of the area located the weapon Aragon had used to shoot Jeanette and Charles, the clothes he had been wearing, and a shovel. In 1976, Cliff Anderson, one of the volunteers who had searched for Dennise, said in a documentary produced by a local high school that the discovery of the shovel led them to believe that Aragon had killed Dennise and buried her body. Since he had disposed of the shovel with the incriminating evidence, it presumably was evidence of part of his crime. 2 sets of footprints were seen on Polar Mesa near an old airstrip. It appeared that one person was forcing another person, who had small feet, to follow them. However, photographs were not taken and plaster casts were not made of these prints before the high winds in the area blew them away, so it could not be determined whether or not they were connected to Dennise and her disappearance. A vast area was searched for Dennise or any proof of what became of her. However, she in fact may not have made it very far from the initial crime scene. In a 2022 article, journalist Jim Stiles detailed a scenario in which Aragon did not abduct Dennise, and she instead remained close to where her mother had been killed. Markings on Aragon's vehicle, as well as the Volkswagen, indicate that when Dennise tried to flee Aragon in the Volkswagen, he came up behind it and rammed it from behind with his car. When this did not get Dennise to stop, he pulled up and slammed the passenger side of his car into the driver's side of the Volkswagen. Even this did not get Dennise to stop initially. However, there was a culvert up ahead, and Dennise had to stop or else she would have driven into it. As she could not get out through the driver's side door, she would have had to climb over the gear shift and the passenger seat to exit from the passenger side door. It is important to note that whatever happened to Dennise after she exited the car had to have happened very quickly. We know that Leonard Brown arrived at the scene just a few minutes later. We know Aragon would have realized someone was coming because he would have been able to hear the loud car at that distance and potentially see its headlights. Aragon would have realized that he needed to leave quickly. However, we also know that Aragon was not moving very quickly at the time. A witness who saw him just an hour before Jeanette, Charles, and Dennise came upon him on the road reported that he had been limping and seemed to be in pain. He may have been unable to chase Dennise, who was young, healthy, and full of adrenaline, through the desert. Given the limits of time and Aragon's mobility, if Aragon did kidnap Dennise, it is most likely that he was only able to because she gave up her efforts to escape as soon as she was run off the road and got into Aragon's vehicle without trying to run away. If Dennise had still been trying to run away, she would not have been able to run very far. She would have had to make her way down a sandstone incline which ended in a cliff, which is difficult to perceive even in the light of day. She may not have noticed it at all in the darkness. If she fell off the edge of the canyon here, she would have fallen approximately 100 feet, which could have been fatal. If she had seen it and stopped, Aragon may have caught up with her. Rather than try to drag her back up to his car and force her into it, he may have shot her where she stood, because he knew he did not have a lot of time. Her body could have gone over the edge as she fell. The location where the FBI later located Aragon potentially supports this theory. When they began following his car, he was coming from the area of the crime scene. He may not have known for sure if Dennise had been dead or alive when he initially fled the scene, and had gone back to it to look for her. While the initial crime scene was searched thoroughly, search efforts had mainly been focused on areas outside of it, operating under the assumption that Dennise had been abducted and taken away from the scene. However, reports note that the area around the Volkswagen had been trampled soon after Dennise was last seen, possibly due to the number of people who had come to help. However, this may have destroyed evidence indicating if Dennise ran from the car and in which direction she had fled. The area where Dennise or her body could have fallen was largely inaccessible and covered in juniper bushes and boulders that could have easily concealed Dennise's body from view from a distance. Even if law enforcement had been able to search at the bottom of the ravine, the landscape could have very easily kept her body hidden from them. The possibility exists that Dennise met her tragic end very quickly, which is perhaps more merciful than the possibility that she was abducted and terrified for potentially up to 2 days before she was killed. 1961 soon saw the death of another family member. William Beaver, Jeanette's father and Dennise's grandfather, passed away just 3 months after Jeanette was killed and Dennise went missing. His death occurred while the legal proceedings concerning custody of his other granddaughter, 4-year-old Jean, were still underway. William and his wife Grace had filed for custody of her, but so had her absent father, as well as her aunt and uncle. Even after William's death, a judge ruled that being adopted by Grace would be what was best for Jean, because of the close relationship they had for all of Jean's life. While they knew Dennise was almost certainly dead, Grace and Jean found themselves holding on to fantasies of Dennise having amnesia after sustaining a head injury, and living a happy life with a family who had taken her in to care for her. Even more than a decade later, as it became harder for Grace to maintain her house as she aged, she did not want to sell it, in case Dennise came there looking for her. It would be years before Grace and Jean could fully give up hope of Dennise returning home. Any hopes Charles Boothroyd may have had of a second marriage and a fresh start in life seem to have died with Jeanette. He never remarried. However, he remained active in the life of Jeanette's younger daughter, Jean. He was always there for Christmas and for her birthdays. Jean was married in 1974, but the marriage soon ended in divorce. Her grandmother, Grace, the only biological family member left in her life, passed away in 1979. When Jean remarried in 1981, she was not without family at the ceremony, however. Charles was there to serve as father of the bride and walk her down the aisle. Charles passed away in 1989. Jean has remained in contact with his granddaughters. Jean and her husband Lawrence celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 2021, and Jean is now both a mother and a grandmother. Nevertheless, she struggled for decades following the loss of her mother and sister. It took her own daughter telling her that she deserved happiness for her to truly embrace all the good things in her life, even though Jeanette and Dennise were not there to share in them with her. Jean does not have any hate in her heart for Abel Aragon, despite what he did to her family. This is in large part due to the influence of her grandmother, Grace. Over the years, Jean would overhear her grandmother talking about that poor woman when discussing the case, referring to Aragon's widow, Eva. As Jean grew older and was better able to understand what had happened, Grace impressed upon her the importance of looking at all sides of the tragedy, not just what had happened to them. She raised Jean to consider what Aragon's family was feeling, even while she herself was suffering. As such, even though she bears the pain of the loss of her mother and sister, she has never borne the burden of hating the man who took them from her. Jean believes that Aragon may have been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or some other mental health condition stemming from his time in the military. She said in 2021, Mr. Abel Aragon had never done anything horrible like this in his whole life, and something happened. Charles said when he came out of the car with a gun, his demeanor, his face was different. People don't just do this because they're hateful. They do it because there's something wrong, and we have to have compassion for their families too. Jeanette is buried in Rhode Island near her parents. A marker lies nearby for Dennise, although no remains lie beneath it. For now, her body most likely remains hidden somewhere in the Utah desert, waiting to be found and laid to rest, below that marker that waits for her back on the East Coast.